Welcome to MyLife, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A good Tavach, a good week. We continue our journey in the life-changing Sefer HaTanya. This program is made possible by Rena Lights LLC and is in honor and memory of Rabbi Yosef Halevi Weinberg Olav Shalom, Rabbi Moshe Pinchas HaKohen Katz Olav Shalom, Rabbi El HaKohen Khan Olav Shalom, and it is the merit and schus of Rabbi Zevi Cheskel HaKohen and Risha Katz Le'erich Yomim V'Shanim Tevis for many long, healthy years. So we're coming now to the conclusion of chapter 5 in Tanya, and understanding an even deeper relationship that we forge with God through learning Torah. So just to have the context, in chapter 2 we learned about the very nature of the divine soul, how it's a piece, chelik elokam mal mamash, a piece of godliness, as discussed then. Like a child that comes from the very essence of his father's mind, the very genetic material. In chapter 3, he explained how this divine soul has divine faculties of the intellect, the cognitive, and the emotional, and how they're completely dedicated to appreciating and understanding the divine and emotionally experiencing it through love and reverence and the other emotions. In chapter 4, he went to the levushim, the garments of the divine soul. That in addition to the fact that it is the garments, which is how we manifest, express ourselves, thought, speech, and action, and when a person is completely consumed and involved in Torah and mitzvahs, his thought in learning and understanding God in the Torah, God's mind, and speaking, or the mitzvahs that are connected to speech, including learning Torah and speech, and the mitzvahs of Maisa in action. So these garments now completely embrace him, like what a garment is. What is a garment? A garment completely surrounds you. And in turn, it surrounds you and you surround it. What does that mean? That when we do these Torah mitzvahs, machshava dibra ma'aseh, we're embracing God. Yes, it's through garments, but it's like a king who's dressed in garments. So we don't only have the divine soul of chapter 2 and the divine faculties of chapter 3, we now have, as he said, that though they're levushim, in ways they're far, far greater, infinitely greater than the neshama, nefesh, ruach, neshama of the neshama itself, because here the connection is being made that there's an embrace. The son is embracing the father, and the father is embracing the son. Chapter 4. In chapter 5, he goes further. In the language tfisa, less machshava tfisa beiklal, but through Torah we grasp tfisa is more than just embracing. It's internalizing. The awesome yichud, the unity that happens only when you learn Torah. She'en yichud k'mayu nimtza klal begashmis. We don't find such a unity. Where your mind is not just dressed in a garment, like when you do a mitzvah, that you're dressed in the garments of the divine mitzvahs, or that you are embracing God through these garments. But it's actually internalized to the point that it's called mozen, as we learned last week, food. Food goes internally. It's not just a garment. Garments are necessary, and that's what the role of mitzvahs is, as he explained in Gan Eden, that the levush and neshamas b'Gan Eden heina mitzvahs. They're necessary because garments protect, like we see in the human being, with his mozen levush bayis. You have food, sustenance. You have garments that protect us from the elements. And then you have a bayis. Here he's not talking about bayis, the home. He's talking about the first two. The difference is, one is internalized, that we digest and we internalize food, just as food, as is digested and the person becomes one with his flesh and blood, so too the Torah, as he said, when you learn it, it's also called nasa mozel l'nefesh v'chayim b'kirba, becomes a food and sustenance to the nefesh, and v'chayim b'kirba, a life within it, within the soul, which is manifest in the Torah. So too, we need Torah and mitzvahs for these two things. But it's, in addition to protection, it's not just protection. Garments protect us in the spiritual sense of the word, that the great light should not overwhelm us. So you need garments to, like, so-called channel and contain the revelation. Mazon you need because you need sustenance. You need to live. You can't just live on garments. But there's more than just protection. It's also the embrace. Let's not forget, the Alter Rebbe is not going away what he said in chapter 4. That Torah mitzvahs is connected to levushim. We're embracing God, and we're being embraced by God. What he's adding is that Torah has an additional element, the element of mazon, of internalized, causing it to be a yichud nifla. Such a yichud we don't have in a mitzvah, because a mitzvah embraces you, surrounds you like a garment, but the garment doesn't become one with you. Whereas the learning Torah, when you learn Torah and you're understanding how God mind works, your mind becomes one with the idea, and the idea becomes one with your mind, as we said, both ways. The mind completely encompasses the idea, and the idea, we're talking about an idea that's higher than the person's mind. We're talking about a divine idea. Like he gave the example of Reuven argues so, Shimon argues so the Torah tells us what to do. So when you're doing that, your mind is becoming one and melding and merging with God's mind. That's what we learned up till here. So now comes, and one more piece I should add. At the end of that piece, he said, so obviously, we're talking now in Gan Eden, the mazon, the Torah becomes, mazon and neshamas becomes food, sustenance for the souls. And it's a result of what? Just as the mitzvahs we did in this world become the garments that we allow us to experience the divine and embrace the divine in Gan Eden, the Torah becomes the food and the sustenance through. So by learning Torah, she'asku b'Torah, be'elam ha'Torah ha'mazon l'shama she'asku be'elam hazeh b'Torah l'shma. So he adds now the Torah l'shma. The question is, why does he add Torah l'shma? Because he wants to make a point here. He wants to make a point that you can, even if you don't learn Torah l'shma, it's also a yichud nifla. Nevertheless, when you learn it l'shma, what does he teach l'shma? There are many levels of l'shma. Generally, l'shma means not for your own sake, but for God. Not for any benefit of your own. But here, he's teaching l'shma, like he says in the Zohar Vayakel, l'shma hainu kedei lekasher nafshi l'Hashem, which means that the intention of the person learning is to attach his soul to God through understanding the Torah, according to your mind's ability. Ish kefi sichle. So what you have here is the joining of two things. Your mind, because that's why ish kefi sichle, everybody according to their capacity. But you're learning it in a way that bind yourself with the divine. So there's no question, based on what he said earlier, even if a person doesn't have this level of learning, they still are united when they learn Torah. They're united with God's mind in a yichud nifla, an awesome yichud. But when you learn it l'shma, it really brings it fully to life, because what you're doing is connecting, like he says, nafshei l'Hashem. And therefore, it's like when you're eating food. You can eat food for all kinds of ulterior motives. But at the end of the day, if you're eating healthy food, it's going to become part of your flesh and blood, no matter what. But imagine if your intention is to eat it in order to connect with the life sustenance that the food provides. And here in the nimshal, in the moral, to connect and bind the nefesh to God through understanding Torah on your terms, that's what causes this union and this the mazon to be the mazon l'neshama, k'mesha kosav, b'pri eitz chaim. Like he says in Pri Eitz Chaim. And that's where we reached. What we're going to do now is finish the last section, chapter 5, is a brackets. So here's what the Alter Rebbe says. So let's continue learning the end of chapter 5 in Tanya. Va'amozon hi b'chinas er pnimi, va'lavushim b'chinas makifim. So he's introducing now the concept of er pnimi and makifim. Let's discuss what that is. Till now, he said the word levushim and mozin. And he did use the word makif, mukefes b'seicham. But there he used it, as we spoke about, that the mind surrounds the idea surrounds the mind. But now he's introducing two levels of elikus. So Chassidus explains, and this is of course coming from Kabbalah. So he have heard the expressions, makif and pnimi. Another name for it is igulim and yesher. Another name, sevav kalam and mamala kalam. What are these? These are two divine tracks. Two divine forms of energy. One, mamala kalam, that permeates and is tailored to enter into each detail of existence. And makif is that it's also giving sustenance, but it remains somewhat removed. And both are necessary, because the primi is necessary to have a direct relationship, that every piece of existence, when the Eibishter said, Vayemer Elokim Yehi Oyer, that's classic Mamal Kalam. He's saying the words Yehi Oyer, not just saying, I'm going to create the world, but a specific statement, a Asar Ma'imoris, I'm going to create light. That means the Eibishter is taking his energy and channeling it into Oyer. Or Yehi Rakia, may there be a firmament. So this is Elokus, Dvar Hashem, being mislabish, manifesting in each part of creation according to its needs. Makif is sometimes associated with Ratzon Hashem, the general will. He wants an existence. If you don't have Ratzon, you're not going to have an existence either. But Chassidus explains, if you only have Makif, you don't have the details. They're all encompassed in the Ratzon. But you need to break it down in details. In the human being, we also have the two. Study your own body. From my flesh I behold God. On one hand, we need our faculties. We need the power of vision in the eye, the power of listening in the ear, the intelligence in the brain and the mind. And the keli, the container of each vessel, of each receptacle in the human body is a perfect tailored to receive that energy. That's called Eidos B'Kelim, that's Pnimi. In general, we learn 10 Keiches Pnimim. Chabad, Chagas, Nehim. 3 cognitive and 7 emotional. But when you break it down, the truth is all 248, Ramach Evorim, Shasa Gidim, are all essentially, especially the 248, are Eidos Pnimim. But then there's also, let's say, the Chayes Kloli, the general fact that you're alive from head to toe. The life force that keeps you alive is not different than the head or in the toe. The specific revelation, the giluyim of what type of energy, there's much more energy in the brain and the mind than there is, let's say, in your toe. But there's also a makav dikakayach that encompasses the whole person. Another way of explaining it is that's rotzen. I want something. I want to walk. I want to talk. I want to think. I want to study. So the rotzen is actually an equalizer of whatever it is that you're doing. That's the makif. And the primi is the specifics. So now to bring it back to our lives, remember we're talking here about the divine soul that wants to have a full, all-consuming relationship with Elokus, with godliness, as we learned in chapter 2, 3, and 4. So now he's saying, after chapter 4, that there's the general levush, garments, that connect and embrace us with the divine and the divine with us. So there's now an er pnimi and er makif. The mitzvahs, mozin, he bechinas er pnimi. Teira is an er pnimi. It's internalized within us. And the mitzvahs is halavushim bechinas makifim. So though he doesn't repeat here Teira mitzvahs, but it's clearly coming as a continuation of what he spoke till now. And that is that this is er pnimi and levushim. Another important point to emphasize, that till now you could have said, till the bracket, you could say that the difference is they're both the same type of energy. One is internalized and one remains so-called a garment that you embrace and it embraces you. But now he's saying even in the in the hashach itself is different. Teiras hamshach is a pnimi, and mitzvahs hamshach, the transmission is makif, makifim. And now he's going to sum up and continue and say, and this really brings it all together. Because if you stop here, you could ask yourself a question. 1 second here. You can ask yourself the question, so what happened with chapter 4? In chapter 4, the whole point was levushim, and he said there clearly Torah and mitzvahs. He didn't just speak about mitzvahs. He talked about Torah too, as an embrace, embracing the king, as well as the king embracing us, as he explained there at length. In addition, Torah is also one of the mitzvahs. So does Torah have the mila also of levush? And that's what he's going to say now. You see how the Alter Rebbe, the eloquence of tying it all together, that Torah has both milas. But in the classic style of the Alter Rebbe, what he's going to do is explain it through a Maimer Chazal. So let's read again. The food refers to its ability to internalize godliness, and its garments refer to the experience of the transcendent divine lights. Because another way to explain the difference between primi and makiv is immanence and transcendence. Something is internalized, but there's also a transcendent element that mitzvah introduces, which actually has a quality. What's the quality of levush over mozen? If you have seemingly internalized, what do you need makiv? Because makiv reminds you of the grandeur, of the awe, of something that's beyond us. It's like when you're learning with the teacher. So one part of real learning is you have to understand what the teacher is saying. If you don't understand what he's saying, there's no primi, and it remains above your head, period, you're not internalizing it. Mitzvahs don't need that internalization, because Kabbalah says you do the mitzvahs, what God wants you to do. Kavanah of mitzvahs has some internal element, but we'll talk about that later. But there's something else when a teacher is teaching a student. Something does remain above your head. Because if you really want to learn properly, you have to always remember, as much as I know, there's more to know. And you want to maintain a certain transcendent dimension. And especially when you're talking about experience with God. Because we're not talking about two equals. There's one is internalizing godliness, the mozen, the food. But you also want to maintain an element of levush, of makif, the transcendent dimension. And that's what mitzvahs introduce. But Torah, is going to explain now, also has that quality. That's what he says. He continues. L'chein amru Razal, she'atalmud Torah shokol keneged kol hamitzvos. Therefore, our sages say that the study of Torah is equal to all the mitzvahs. This is right at the beginning of the Mishnah and Peah, and brought in some places in Gemara, Kiddush and Shabbos. So what is he saying? That mitzvahs are not just Torah is greater than mitzvahs. Before he used the expression Yediyas HaTorah, he said, the expression he said was, the exact lashon was, V'zeis ma'ili yaseirik g'dei livin niflole ein ketz asher b'mitzvahs Yediyas HaTorah v'asagos al kol ha'mitzvahs maisis. This is the awesome quality and superiority of Torah over mitzvahs. Now he's saying the word shkula. Shkula means it's not just greater, it's equal to and weighs the same amount as kol ha-mitzvahs, which means it also has the quality of mitzvahs. You could say Torah is greater because it's pinimi, mazen, food, b'seich meyai, seirascha b'seich meyai, it's internalized, and mitzvahs has a different quality. In this fact of pinimi, the Torah is greater. But he's saying, no, shkula keneged kol ha-mitzvahs. So what does that mean? Why is it shkula keneged kol ha-mitzvahs? The answer is, that's the study of Torah is equal to all the mitzvahs. Lefi sheha-mitzvahs hein levushim levad, v'ha-Torah hi mozen v'gam levush. Because the mitzvahs are only garments. And Torah is both food and garment. First of all, because the Torah is also a mitzvah, but more specifically, he explains why. That it's both a food and garment, l'nefesh hamaskeles, shemislabish ba b'yuna v'limuda. For the mind, for the intellectual soul, which is absorbed and enclosed in analyzing and studying Torah. So what does this mean? Where's the makif here? We said earlier, when you understand Torah, it becomes internalized. Where's the levush? Because if you recall, in the beginning of the chapter, he said both directions. He said the mind absorbs the idea, and the idea gets absorbed in the mind. And then he says, v'gam, and also, the mind gets enclosed and absorbed in the idea. Because the idea of Torah is higher than the mind. We spoke there about the discussion of the Tzemach Tzedek. And now it comes alive what the Tzemach Tzedek meant to say. Why was the Tzemach Tzedek so keen on explaining this element? Because when you look at the end of the chapter, it's very clear. Torah is two things. One is, yes, your mind absorbs God's mind, but something still remains higher. Something still remains transcendent. Still remains in the gather of levush. So it's a mazon and levush. It's both internal and also remains, it's God's Torah. And when you have both, it's lachodim kecho, that's the yuchad nifla, the makif and the mukaf. And this also explains what he says in chapter 4, that when you learn Torah, you're embracing God. It's just now he added something, not instead of. He added what comes to Torah in addition to embracing and being embraced, we also have the internalization. But the end Torah is both mazon and gam levush. If you remember, the language was that the mind encloses itself in it. Not just that the mind encloses the idea, that the mind absorbs the idea, but the mind is absorbed into the idea. It completely gets absorbed into it. And that is where the idea is makif, the person. So makif now, you can say, in addition to what he said earlier, makif means the idea remains a divine idea that surrounds us. But there you can still say it's united. It's just united in a way that is a higher level. But now you can also say there's the element of actually makif, like the gam levush, l'nefesh hamaskelas. So Torah is both a food which is absorbed in the soul, like food that is internalized, and a garment by which the soul is surrounded and absorbed. So you have both elements here, which is beautiful because now you also have the Torah retains its divine nature. Okay. And then the Alter Rebbe, to even drive the point further home, he concludes, "V'kol shken k'shemeitzi b'piv b'dibur, shehevel adibur nasa b'chinas makiv k'mesh kos b'pri Etz Chaim." And this is even more so. The Torah serving as a garment is further understood and enhanced when you articulate b'piv b'dibur, that the learning is expressed with the barta bom, where you're actually expressing it in words. And what happens when you do that verbally? So shehevel adibur nasa b'chinas makif. Since the breath exhaled into the words, hevel is like the breath of speech. Exhaled into the words elicits nasa and becomes, I wouldn't say it only elicits, it also actually becomes bechinas makif, makif, a transcendent energy. Now what does this mean? So different explanations for it, but briefly, the first explanation is when you see somebody learn something in thought, when you have to articulate it in words, you reach a deeper level. But there's another element here. Why is that the case? Because dibur, it's hevel hadibur, which is breath. Even though you're speaking the words, and seemingly it's a lower level than the garment of thought, which is much more connected to you and your mind, but the very speech creates a aura, an environment, a makif. So if you see someone sitting and learning Torah, and there's no words at all, so there's a lot of internalization. But when he also speaks the words, there's a voice, the hevel, the breath of the words to create a environment. You ever feel, you hear the nigun of Torah, you hear someone singing or learning Torah, there's a certain, it creates an environment, it creates a climate, an atmosphere, and that's makif. So the dibur reaches a level of makif, and that's more specific. So you also have the makif of, not just of the vush, not just the mozen of Teir. As stated in Pri Etz Chaim at the beginning. So what do we conclude now that we finished Perek Hey? What we see here is that the Alter Rebbe, in the most powerful way, explains, without even getting yet into the other side of things, which is the animal soul, but explains, what does he explain? How the divine soul is all consumed, involved with godliness, both in a form of makif, in a form of pnimi, with each one with its own qualities. Chapter 4 was primarily the makif. In chapter 5 was the pnimi. But now you see he's bringing it back to the levush because we want that as well. We want to connect with God on every level, not just internalizing on our terms, but also on God's terms, and that's where you need the levush. Someone asked me a question, and this is a good opportunity. If you want to ask questions, just go to tanyaapplied.com. Why does the Alter Rebbe say yichud nifla she'en yichud kamoya begashmis? An awesome unity, an integration that you don't find anyone physically, when just a few lines later, he says, like physical food also becomes a yichud nifla, no? When you eat food, so before you ate it, the food was outside of you. Now it's become damu basar kibsari, become part of your flesh and blood. And the Alter Rebbe actually uses that as an example to understand the Torah as mazon, spiritual food for the soul. But remember, food, the bread itself, or the food itself does not become one with you. You have to break it down, digest it, expel the waste, and allow the nutrients to then become part of our blood. With Torah, yes, you need to digest it and understand it, but there's no waste, God forbid. And it's that God's mind is becoming one with your mind. Just to answer that question. Okay, so with this we conclude chapter 5 in Tanya. Torah being both Mozen and Levush. And we'll stop here, and next week we'll begin chapter 6, which now goes to the other side. He's going to come back to chapter 1, the first nefesh, the animal soul. And just as the Alter Rebbe explained the divine soul in exhaustive detail, he's now going to explain the animal soul. And in Perek Tes, he's going to come to bring them both back together, both souls, and the battle that they fight with each other. So everyone be well, have a good tevach. As I mentioned, TanyaApply.com is the place to submit questions, and you can also find archives of previous classes. Be well.
This has been My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit chasidusapplied.com for archived classes and more resources.